So being CCL, we like to start on time, and I'll introduce the Conservative Caucus Chairman, Dr. Rob Beggs.
Thanks, Grant. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit of what we're going to do today. We're going to have two presentations, one by Grant Couch, then Bruce Tierney, and then we're going to have some questions and Q&A from our esteemed panel here. So our presenters, we have Grant Couch from Boulder, Colorado. He's the founder of the Conservative Caucus, and he has a background in corporate finance. Bruce Tierney from Orange County, California, and Bruce is going to do most of our emceeing. He's engineering and enterprise software marketing experience, and he was a fantastic help at the Republican State Convention in Southern California that we had a presence at. Peter Bryn, Houston, Texas. Peter, and former Exxon engineer. He's half-time, actually half of his staff time is as conservative coordinator, and he's done a ton of outreach in Texas, which is a challenging area, so he can answer questions on that. Dr. Bill Curtis, down at the end from Ocean Springs, Mississippi. 30 years in the chemical industry, chapter leader in community level outreach in a very conservative area, and he's got a great knowledge of technical energy details, so if you want to ask questions about that. Zori Zimmerman, Boston, Massachusetts, originally from Kentucky, got a strong business and institutional background as CEO of Zori Zimmerman Associates, so if you have some more practical business level questions, she'll be good for that. And last but not least, Jay Butera, who's been doing such fabulous work with outreach and getting members of Congress, getting community members and chambers of commerce and other folks to come in with members of Congress and make real progress. Slide. Which is the green middle. I'm just going to say something real brief about the Conservative Caucus. What we are, we're a CCL group whose members are either registered Republicans or, and quite a few of us, are fiscally conservative independents. So if you have associates, friends, relatives who are either of that group and are kind of interested in climate, put them in touch with us. We're really trying to grow our group, trying to grow our influence, and have a lot of fun. We do a lot of work with state and local governments, outreach to business groups. We also, we participate in Republican conventions and county level Republican events. So we're doing as much direct outreach and getting as much visibility as we can. We also engage, we have monthly calls as a general group, and then we also have certain subcommittees that have calls and action items. And that's pretty much a quick summary how we work, and with that I'm going to turn it over to Grant Couch, who's our first presenter. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. A little background. Let me go ahead and... So, my first time with CCL was 3 years ago. We were still at the Liaison Hotel. We were getting excited about hitting 5,000 members total, not yet reached. And there were 375 people that showed up for that. And one of our presenters was Dr. Sue, who's an economist and lawyer, and he interrupted his presentation. He'd written a book about pricing carbon. It's a great book. He interrupted himself to ask the question, how many Republicans are in this audience? 3 hands went up. 3 hands out of 375, but worse than that, the snickers were audible. And after that, I went up to Mark and I said, hey, at that time we were bipartisan, not nonpartisan, which we've learned from George Shultz is a better term to call ourselves as nonpartisan. Mark, we got a problem. I understand we're nonpartisan or bipartisan at the time, but how can we be that if we don't have any? And he said, good point, do something about it. So with Rob and others, we created the caucus, and honestly the first thing we did was to go through a lot of the messaging of CCL that had a lot of unnecessarily off-putting phraseology. that put off conservatives that didn't serve any purpose. And then we started to recruit. And we took a survey January of 14, so that was 6-7 months after that conference. And we found at that time that we were slightly over 3% in this political affiliation survey, slightly over 3% Republican, conservative, libertarian. So the caucus knew that we had to dig in to expand, and so we're doing what we can. But I'm curious, how many conservatives or Republicans do we have in the audience now? Well, that's more than 3. That's great. But I know that everyone else in the audience recognizes the need to bring in, to have a better conversation with conservatives, or you wouldn't be here. So let me ask the question next of how many of you have family members or friends who are Republican or conservative? So there's your solution. There's your solution. We're a limited number. We're digging in, we're doing what we can, but we need you to do what you've been trained to do over the last couple of days, to talk to Republican members of Congress, Republican staff members, but talk to Republican family members and friends. And listen. Bring them in the fold, because they care, but they have their issues. And so what I'm going to talk about, I call this stepping across the aisle, and I do have a little bit of a irritation with being asked to talk about how do you talk to conservatives. I live in Boulder, Colorado, and Boulder, Colorado is very, very deep blue. And I got to tell you, it's kind of hard talking to progressives. So I'm not going to talk about the specifics of how one talks to conservatives because, of course, primarily being progressives, you need a little help with that. Bruce will address that. What I want to talk about is learning to understand our differences and how they relate to others and how they relate to our own biases so that we can learn to step across the aisle. This is the slide. I've got 2 quotes there, one from arguably the most famous Western philosopher, the most highly regarded, David Hume, who I'm happy to say was a very close friend of Adam Smith. Reason is and ought only be the slave of passion and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. And I think many of us forget that it's the passions that drive us, and it's the reason that supports why we do what we do. Which leads to the next one. This is a social scientist at, where is he? University of Michigan. So he's still alive, unlike Hume. In matters of public opinion, citizens seem to be asking themselves not what's in it for me, but rather what's in it for my group. And this is very important. I think those of you who've been in the earlier presentations heard a lot about tribe. Jerry Taylor was talking about the tribal need to protect. And it's a very, very important thing to remember. And if we attack someone's tribal views, they're not going to listen to anything else. And that's true of each of you too. And so it's important to remember that before you can understand someone else, you need to understand your own biases. And I'm going to go through a couple of slides that will hopefully help you with that. But remember that, because the tribal issues, the tribal biases that we live by, because we don't have the time to identify every issue and the proper solution and understanding of every issue and have a really well-informed individual view. So what do? We default to thought leaders that we respect, thought leaders that share our cultural view, our political view, or our religious view. I don't know whether the people in the back can read the subtitle. So the subtitle says, and there's the picture, if you can't really see the picture, the wife sitting on the couch looking away from the husband, not very happy. The husband having a very serious conversation with his young son. Your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the country and your mother doesn't. They walked down the aisle together, but they didn't stay together. And they weren't really understanding that each of them wants what's best for the country. They both, though, have different views of what's best. And it doesn't make one right or wrong, because we have to live together. And if we don't, and I'm talking we as CCL, if we don't get Republicans and conservatives involved and to support this, then even if we can jam through something, it won't last. And we are all impacted by this, and we all need to be in it together. So even though you may disagree with the political views in many of these issues, the folks on the other side of the aisle really have in their minds what they think is the best interest of the country. So understanding ourselves and others, I want to go through the different worldviews and culture, and I'm going to do this all in another 9 minutes, so don't worry. Moral foundations which affect our political views, and the faith and religion. And I think it's important in this last point here to know and respect the differences between your views and others. And that's not to say that you need to respect the opinion, because you may not, but you really, really need to respect the person who holds that opinion. Respect the believer, but not necessarily the belief. Big difference. I love graphs. I'm an engineer, and I'm a finance guy. So this comes out of Yale, a guy named Dan Kahane, and the Yale Cognition Studies, and it's a grid that we don't really understand if no one's put it in front of you. You don't understand how this impacts your own view, and that others may have different views. So some people are very comfortable living in an area where dad's boss is clearly the boss, or there's a hierarchy, and they respect that hierarchy. They find comfort in that hierarchy. And then there are others who hate hierarchy and think everyone's equal. There's pluses and minuses to both. And if you are an egalitarian, it disgusts you to think that anyone would succumb to authoritarian pressure. If you are an authoritarian, you are confused why people don't have someone giving them guidance and helping bring the community together to get things done. So they're different worldviews. You can criticize one or the other, but understand that these are embedded in people's personalities, and that's how they live. Same with the horizontal axis. You can believe that you ought to, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that you eat what you kill, you're on your own, that's the way it is, or we're all in the communitarian, as it's called. And it was interesting when we were, I think Jerry answered the question this morning about, it was Bill, I think, Twist, in terms of the indigenous people. And a lot of the analysis that's done in terms of cultural views don't really look at things outside the West. But if I were going to put indigenous people here, they're clearly on the solidarity, communitarian side. For them, there's very little of an individualist kind of view, but that's an aside. But this grid is very important. And what this grid does, it's a short piece, you can look it up, Cultural Cognition and Public Policy by Dan Kahane, maybe 15 pages, and it explains how someone can be very comfortable being for abortion and opposed to capital punishment, and the reverse. And it's a beautiful way to not change your mind on your own views, but to understand how others can come to feel very strongly about their views, not to try to change their views, you don't change yours, but understand the differences and then walk with that knowledge in a way that finds common ground. Mark talked about this graph. He didn't have the graph, but he talked about these 5 basic moral foundation building blocks that Jonathan Haidt mentioned in his book, The Righteous Mind. And if you want to understand politics and the differences between liberals and conservatives, I don't think there's a better book than this. So I recommend it very highly. You'll see the next slide, there are 6 building blocks. There's only 5 on this chart. Why is that? Because the 6th building block is freedom from tyranny. Freedom. Everybody accepts that to a lesser or greater degree, but it's a very constant, important building block for both liberals and conservatives. I'm talking social conservatives. But what you can see on this chart is that fairness and care are very, very high for liberals. So there's two, other than the freedom one, there's two primary building blocks that mean something to liberals. On the other hand, social conservatives have 5. I mean, one might say, I'm not, but one might say that there's a broader, deeper, richer moral foundation for conservative values than liberal. I'm not saying it, but I mean, you could draw your own conclusions. So the thing that's important, though, is that the fairness, and I'm pointing down there because I can see that better, but what's above fairness and care for social conservatives are authority, sanctity, and loyalty. I'm going to go to the next slide and sort of roll through these. We all like that. I mean, that's important to every one of us. Every American, that's what makes America America. Care and harm, cherishing and protecting others is important to everyone, but to a much greater degree to liberals. Fairness, cheating. It's interesting. Fairness and cheating means different things to different people. Is it fair for someone to get more than what they really worked for? Is it fair for someone to not have the same opportunity as someone else? You know, these are different ways of looking at it from different ends of the spectrum. Not right or wrong, but just understand that they're different. Loyalty, betrayal. I don't think I have any progressive friends that would understand anything about loyalty except perhaps to hopefully their spouse, their children. But in terms of loyalty to a tribe, I don't see that. But it is a very important part of the social conservative moral foundation. An authority, same thing. That means something to conservatives. Nothing, or very little, to liberals. And the last one is the one I think that causes the most problem, and the one that is so viscerally felt by social conservatives is the sanctity issue. And again, have a different view. But reach inside yourself and find those things that are so important to you that they grab your gut when you can't stand it, if it's not the way you think it ought to be. And understand that same passion, that same challenge rests with conservatives when you're interfering with things that, to their way, are violating sanctity, violating authority. Accept it or not. Don't agree with it if you don't want to. But recognize that when you're dealing with folks who feel that way, that's very, very important to them. And you need to find a way to at least not threaten that and maybe embrace it if you can find a way to embrace it. Five narratives that work across faiths. And before I get to this, I'm just curious, any questions on what I've done so far? I know we're going to do them at the end, but I just...
issue with a couple of your points on the last slide.
Give me one.
Loyalty in terms of liberals, loyalty to a tribe. We all have our own tribes that I think we're loyal to. And I don't think there's a big difference between conservatives and liberals in that respect. I'd like to know where you got your information on that and the resources for that, because I personally feel loyal to more than just one thing, and certainly more than just to my husband.
Okay, a good point, and maybe I overstated the case. So what she said was she feels, she doesn't agree that liberals don't feel loyalty, and I think as I go back to the chart, unroll, okay, oops. So it's not that loyalty isn't important to liberals, it's just much less important for liberals. And that's not what I said. But this is the book.
But it doesn't have a difference of opinion.
Right, and I'm going off of what Jonathan said. Yeah.
I'd also challenge you on relationship with authority. For example, the so-called conservative anti-climate
Okay.
respect to authority, whereas we here really respect.
You accept that, you accept the authority of scientists, and they don't accept the authority of scientists because they don't see the scientists as an authority in their tribe, right? So I hear the point, and I just wanted to, one more, and then I'll continue.
What I would say is, you need to read the book, because you might be more moderate than you think you are. Read the book. It's a very good book.
Thank you. He's much better at speaking his truth than I am. So, okay, so go back. So this is this comes from the Climate Outreach Information Network, George Marshall at Oxford. And the work that was done here, and this is when you're dealing with folks who have of a different faith, or people of deep faith, and you may not have religious faith of your own that is one of the traditional ones. And it's important to understand the differences with these. These 5 are the ones that resonate with virtually all of the major faiths. And I'm not going to take more time to go deeper into it. I recommend that you look at the website for the Climate Outreach Information Network. George Marshall's quite a guy, and he's got some good information. The next one I wanted to touch on, because these are landmines. There can be landmines when you're dealing with folks of faith. Each of those words can mean different things and can be very challenging. The last one is, how could there be a challenge to natural limits, some of you might say. And for some faiths, the answer to that is God provides. It's hubris for us to think that we can identify limits because God provides. For example, blame, justice, they mean different things to different people. So those are just hot buttons to stay away from. I will wrap it up now with, in that 10 minutes, you got a good description of all the differences, so now you know. How do you find the common ground? The most important sales technique, most important sales tool that we each have, and I think you've heard this said many times in the earlier presentations, is to listen, use your ear. One opening when we're talking about climate is this one does have, we think, at CCL, has a great solution that really works for everybody. So know the areas of disagreement, respect them, as I said, and remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. You want to build relationships. And when you're listening, it sometimes can take you 2 months or 6 months or a year to really hear. And it's more important to really understand where they're coming from than it is for you to pitch what it is you're trying to pitch. So take your time. There's a trick on this page. What's wrong with one of these points? The third one, I'm stating what's important to me rather than asking what's important to you first. So what's important to you? It's a great line. It's a great opener, and that's how you find out, an open-ended question. I'll leave you with one last story. I sat next to an Episcopal minister at lunch today. She has a diocese responsibility for climate, and she's in a diocese that has conservatives. And she's had some talks when she's been attacked afterwards, or gotten some emails later on like, why are you doing this? And I disagree, and you're wasting my time and the diocese time. So I suggested to her that she, through her office, reach out and ask the conservatives in her group and in the diocese who have any interest, any opinion on the climate, to come in and speak to her, because all she hears about climate is from progressives. So bring in the conservatives, just the conservatives, and let them come in, and don't advocate anything, just ask them for their opinions. And I said some of them will be denialists. Some of them will say, nah, it's whatever. Don't answer that. Throw it back to the group and say, well, is this how the whole group feels? And let the members of the tribe talk about it. Because in the end, we all care. We just need to let down the barriers that we have within, that we've built up for our different worldviews and tribes, etc. We need to let those down so that our hearts can come out. We care. We all care. We have tribal challenges. We have all kinds of issues that distract us, but we all care. Thank you very much.
All right. So Grant, thank you so much for that, and I particularly enjoyed your comic. However, I'm not going to be showing that to my wife. All right, so I want to build on one of the themes Grant talked about. He talked about changing minds. So I want to give you a couple specific activities that you can implement in the next couple days. So let's start off. So this is you walking into the office tomorrow, into your Republican congressperson's office. And you're all armed. You've got your laser talks ready to go. You've read some of the Reframing report. You don't want to admit you haven't read as much as you wish you, well, you hope everyone thinks you have. But you're all ready to go. You walk into the office, and what's going on in their mind? And there's a pretty good chance, I know this was the case for me when I had done this, that they might be thinking climate change is not human caused. And here comes the environmentalist. I had that term come back to me in my meeting with my legislative director, and it caught me off guard. And then the next question was, the next comment they're probably thinking, I have real issues to deal with. So it's important for us to know that this might be the case in your congressman. Hopefully you'll figure this out before you go in, but we have to understand that perspective. And to Grant's point, changing minds, how do we go about changing minds? So this is sort of an alarming statistic. This is in Yale research that we use very heavily. And it's of those who do not think global warming is happening, 93% say they cannot be convinced that global warming is happening, and attempting to change their mind is going to cause them to dig their heels in. So what do we do? 93% say there's nothing you can do to change their mind, and I'm guessing some of those 7 are just kind of saying that because they want to sound like they're open-minded. So it's a pretty big challenge, right? So we have a very difficult challenge. So what's our strategy? Obviously, we know there is a technique, right? We've heard all from Jay and many of the other people that have done some amazing things, so it can be done. The other approach we can take is say, forget it. Let's just go to adapt and enjoy and head off to Venice Beach, and get some chaise lounge chairs. And I do have to admit that looks a little mysteriously like Marshall Saunders in the back left. Maybe Mark Reynolds, front right. And I'm going to ask Chris Preston if that's him in the front left. So no, that's of course not what we do, right? We're CCL. So let's look at a couple strategies that we can consider. So I want to encourage you, let's say the next couple days, you head back tomorrow or Wednesday, and you know of a family friend or you know of a business colleague that's somewhere in the 6 Americas. They're disengaged or just sort of not denial, some sort of not accepting of the issue, right? Dismissive. So you want to have you want to have a conversation with them, and you'd rather it not get to this left side here. You don't want it to be, it hasn't warmed since 1998, science is unsettled, there's no consensus. Many of us have heard these comments. I've heard them at a recent tabling event. So what do we do in this situation? And you don't want to have to react on the spot. You want to have a formula for how you get out of this and get to where we want to be. So this is reframing. This is one way you can reframe the conversation. We know we are successful with our argument. We have a conservative solution to climate change. So when we bring the conversation over, we reframe it to topics like, well, there's government regulations, the EPA, there's also lightweight, transparent approaches, big government, small government, cap and trade, market-based, these sorts of themes. You energize the conversation, and that's where you get to common ground. So the challenge is, how do you get from the left to the right? So let's go through an example here. The science is unsettled, right? You talk to your family friend tomorrow or Wednesday, and they come back with this. What's your response? How do you get over to the right side? And really it's about a pivot, some sort of pivot you have that you sort of work through in your mind, you have ready to go. Here's one example. You could say, when you hear the science is unsettled, you could say, I completely understand what you're saying, so you're validating their point. And then you could say the main objection about climate change is on the solutions, or the science of the solutions. And then you get over to the topic on the right, and then you're having that discussion. We know we can win there. So what I encourage you to do is really carve out a half an hour in the next day or two to develop a pivot that you like, you're comfortable with, or multiple pivots. So when this comes, you have this sort of 2-3 step process ready to go. The other thing I want to talk about too is this notion of science, right? For those of you that have gone through Move Over Misconceptions, I know Ellie Sparks has that on a podcast, or you may have heard it here at the conference. She talks about some listening techniques in there. And so one flow that we have this appreciation, you go through the conversation further. Sometimes people, especially in PowerPoint presentations, you see a lot about the science conversations and then the ask. So another way to approach that is you do your appreciation, have some more conversation, hold off on the science until you're invited to talk about it. That's the term Ellie uses in that. Wait till you're invited to talk about the science. Continue on and hold off again. And if you're not ever asked about the science, don't bring it up that time. Right? We know some of the topics in some of the work, some of the books, like Grant was talking about, the moral foundation concept. Those are the areas that are going to resonate well, where you can bring it over. If it's 2016 and just delivering the science to them is going to turn them, that's hard to imagine, right? Everyone has had 100 times to have heard the science, regardless of what channels they're watching on TV. So this is a good common theme. It's important for you to know the science, have it in maybe the appendix, have it ready to go. And of course, this varies by individual, right? You might talk to a conservative skeptic, science is just perfect for them. But in general, this is a good concept to think about. So what are the words? If we're not talking about the science, what are some of the words that are going to appeal to conservatives? Free market, eliminate subsidies, American ingenuity, energy freedom, all these types of terms are very proven terms that work well in the conversation. The one I'll mention, free market, I like to use market-based. I think that's a very valid approach for what we're talking about. You don't want to get into a discussion on, well, free market, if the government's assessing a fee at the point of entry, is that free? So market-based is a really nice term to use, where we're not picking winners and losers. And one of the things I thought would be an interesting test of that, was to look at the Gibson Resolution. So I went through, read that document, it's a very brief document, and looked at the words. So this is our perfect target profile of who we want to appeal to. So what is it that the Republicans in Congress are signing up to? What words are they using? And so these are the words that I pulled directly out of that. These are quotes from that document. And you see some themes in here, a lot of sort of the militaristic themes, the quantifiable facts on the ground, quadrennial defense review, threat multiplier, aggravate stressors abroad. So that terminology resonates very well. Exceptionalism, tradition of American ingenuity, market factors, and then conservative, those sorts of terms. So I thought that was a really interesting source to look at and see what fits exactly with our target audience. And then I want to touch, Jay, do you recognize this guy? Want to touch on some listing on analysis. So tee this up for some of our conversation on the panel here. And I won't go into too much of this because we have one of the sources here with us. So the leader letter was one choice. And I was in one of the other sessions. It doesn't have to be just Chamber of Commerce. The previous session had something like 11 municipal leader letters signed. Peter and the team were talking about that. It was I think it was Salt Lake City and Philadelphia. So really impressive there. So keep your creative thinking going of who you can pull in. So just an amazing list of signatures in these letters. Just fantastic. And then the other one is Chamber of Commerce. I'll say a couple comments on this. There is on their website today, it's a document, it's actually dated 2010, but they have a statement on climate change in there, and it reads beautifully for us. There should be a comprehensive legislative solution that does not harm the economy, recognize that the problem is international in scope. I mean, this screams for our CCL solution. And you can kind of go through that list and just see how nicely they align with what we have in our description here. And the one point I want to make about this, I think Zori was mentioning earlier, you want to be very careful how you use this. There's a lot of times the Chamber of Commerce, some of the things they're saying do not align well with our mission. However, if you are going to meet with a local Chamber of Commerce, be very aware of this document. This might be a good one to start a conversation. So I mentioned keeping your mind open on different ideas of how you can reach out to allies. And when I first got into this, I thought, okay, there's Chamber of Commerce, there's business, maybe religious leaders, not too much more. And I keep hearing more and more creative ideas. Robin Ganal is in our Orange County district, and she decided, because Mimi Walters, our congressperson, is very focused on family. She's always talking about family, my 4 kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so then Robin went to look at the California PTA website, and they have a similar type of statement that says climate change is a children's issue, that you should advocate for national legislation for climate change. California PTA is telling their districts to do this. So fantastic wording from there, a great gold mine that she discovered. And she's also going to go to Girl Scouts Next. She's actually pulled in the local president of the PTA and had a meeting with one of Mimi Walter's staffers. So when I see this, I just think, oh my gosh, there's so many different allies that you can pull in. And then the last one here on business. So we all think about business ones. Sort of a quick tip here, opensecrets.org. I recommend you check that one out, put in your congressperson, and you can see a prioritized list or a ranked list of their contributors. Search out those contributors, see if you can engage them in the conversation. That's probably going to be an ally that's going to get you a face-to-face or something else along those lines. So here's a little fun. What I'm recommending is practice communication. So those of you may have seen the outstandingly hilarious Saturday Night Live skit, how Adele saves everything on Thanksgiving. So I recommend you practice communication maybe the next couple of days, one-on-one in a safe environment. And then after you've done that, Google this, because it's pretty hilarious if you haven't seen it. So to summarize my portion here, first off, get inside their mind. So that same book, The Righteous Mind, Grant was talking about, that's an excellent resource. Republican Brain. And then a couple other comments. These are from Peter Joseph, one of his presentations I found very valuable. And he says, don't let others be wrong. Provide Republicans a way to win here. Right? We know we almost can't change their mind. So we have to prove them right. And it's going to take a little more sort of creativity and brilliance on our side to make that happen. But we know it can happen because it has been happening. Okay, so focus on common ground. So with that, thank you for listening into that section. Let me bring up Peter Bryn.
Let's see, is that working? Okay. So I will try to keep this brief because I know I'm between us or I'm between you and the panel. So as Rob mentioned, I now have the part-time staff role of Conservative Director. And as was also mentioned, we have and thank you to Grant for pushing that. He said we need somebody on staff with that title because we have numbers that could be improved in terms of our percentage of conservative-leaning volunteers. So that is the task that I have taken on, is to find out how we can help you to attract and retain more conservative volunteers in your chapter, because we want to make sure that our volunteer base is reflective of the political diversity in your local communities. So, my goal is to help CCL grow the number of conservatives, but again, I need your help to do it. The number one resource that this organization has, I think, in doing that is the Conservative Caucus, of which this is a portion. Everybody's walking around at the red banners under their name tags. You can identify some volunteers here who are members. And I rely very heavily on that as a resource in this effort. So, as Rob mentioned, we sort of do two things. We do a lot of national outreach, and that's really important to what we do. But in terms of what we represent for the organization, I think it's also important. We are sort of a home for conservatives who are looking for like-minded people to work with, to talk to. And if you find yourself in a chapter somewhere that is, let's say, overrun with progressive-minded people, and you're afraid that perhaps a conservative might come in and say, maybe this isn't the right place for me, I would strongly recommend you put that person in touch with the caucus, because they can then talk to folks across the country who share their worldview, and perhaps once they get over that hump, we'll get more involved in their local chapter. Even if they're sort of the outcasts, they can feel comfortable in that environment. So what I just want to talk briefly about are some resources and tools that we're introducing that are, well, actually some have been up for a while. We're trying to clean them up and aggregate them. So the first is an opportunity for all of you. If you have questions, how many of you are on the CCL Community Conservative Caucus Action Team Board? Does anybody remember that? So if you go to Action Teams at the top, click Conservative Caucus, you can join up to be a member. I have the 1, 2, 3 as to how to get there on the screen. But basically, this is not just the membership of the caucus. This is really an open forum for all of you to ask questions. If you're looking for help, one of the volunteers in the caucus will respond to that. The other resource I'll point you to is the Conservative Outreach Resources page. If you go to Volunteer Resources, Outreach, click Conservative. There are a couple of resources I want to point you to. I'm new in this role, so it's still in development, but a couple of things I want to point you to that could be helpful. The first two listed are messaging tips and presentation. These are both in the coming soon category, so they're not up there yet. There are a lot of legacy resources that volunteers have come up with, and basically what we want to do, working with Bruce, who's our messaging director, that's the role he holds in the caucus, and others, is we want to sort of aggregate all this and come up with, and really field test in front of Republican groups around the country, what is the best presentation that is a template that we can use and roll out to all of CCL to use in reaching out to conservative audiences. Also messaging tips, what are sort of the do's and don'ts of messaging. Some of that already exists. If you need it immediately, you can get in touch with me. We have some legacy resources I can share. But that's coming out soon. We also created the flyer. I don't know if have any of you seen this, any of you used this. This turned out to be worked really well. We got a lot of good feedback. It's the Conservative flyer. This is a full page, or there's also a quarter page one that Rob developed that we're going to be putting up soon. But basically what this is intended to do is put the big word conservative on the page so somebody who's walking by your table at a tabling event, or if you're at a conservative event and you just want to hand out flyers to folks, it's something that says, are you a conservative who's concerned about climate change? There are some folks you should meet, and it kind of puts our CCL conservative creds all on the page to try to welcome them in and feel like maybe this is something I should take a look at. And then it sort of invites them in to talk with people at the caucus. The final thing I'll just mention is that we are trying to create action ideas. And the idea here is that the caucus is trying to create pathways for people around the country in CCL to take certain actions that we've made available. So one, Republican, which is Bob Inglis's group. We have a good relationship with Bob Inglis, of course. We're working on an event in Texas where we're going to have him come. There's a couple of Republican groups that are co-sponsoring a talk by Bob. We're going to do a couple of city tour for him. If others are interested in having Congressman Inglis come to your city, let me know, and we're happy to help you engage local Republican groups to hopefully get that off the ground. The R Street Institute, we've done some work again in Texas at the state level with them, so that's another idea where you can lobby state politicians. So we're trying to create these action ideas. In a couple of days, we're going to meet with the college Republicans, we're going to meet with the log cabin Republicans, try to create more avenues for folks all around the country to work with local chapters of these organizations. So that's how to find conservatives. How do we keep them? That's the important part, right? So, the number one thing I would just say, and we say this again and again, make your chapter a comfortable place for them. Ask people, leave your politics at the door. Here we're focused on climate, we're focused on being respectful and respect and appreciation. Make it a welcome place for people to come and have those meetings. And again, I'd say use the Conservative Caucus as a resource. Invite these folks to join the caucus or to learn more about it. We now have regional contacts around the country who can sort of act as a somewhat local point of contact for them in the caucus. And the email, you can point them to the CCL community page or conservatives@citizensclimate.org. That's sort of our Conservative Caucus help desk. And I think that is, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, super quick. We're going to run through. Actually, you know what? Let's skip these. I want to get straight to our panel. All right, let's go right to our panel questions. So first off, first question, and be sure if you have any, pass them on in. So the first question is, conservatives fear, Jerry Taylor said earlier today, conservatives fear turning government loose on the climate problem will bring down our free market system, global government, etc. What do we say to this? Any thoughts from the panel on that one?
Repeat the question?
Yeah, so conservatives fear turning government loose on the climate problem will bring down our free market system, global government, etc. What do we say to this? So it's almost as though, when we think about that they don't accept the problem, a lot of it is the concern about the solution, right? They're fearing it's going to be a single, I think you used the term, single central government. How do we handle that objection? Anything from you three who haven't had a chance yet?
I think that, okay. To me, I don't think the question is a very good question. I think there's, say again?
Tell us what you really think.
Well, no, it's just, no, I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feeling, but it sounded a little strong to me. I think the conservatives don't feel like it's a plot to necessarily bring down, that it's...
He's talking about the Koch brothers. That was a
Oh,
reference
the
to the
Koch-
Koch brothers. They're pretty extreme. Yeah, that's not
Oh.
all conservatives.
Yeah, that's, okay, that's the best way to put it. That's a very narrow conservative opinion, and it's usually not too hard to
I
get around
think in
that.
terms of the one world government concern, that's a narrow opinion. But I do think there's a broader concern that it's a big issue, so therefore the response has to be big government. One of the things I would say is, I kind of fall back on the same argument a lot of the time, but in terms of that specific concern, I would offer, if we're not engaged in this issue, something's coming. What you're going to get is a big government solution unless you get engaged in this discussion. So that's sort of the kind of the hardline position of get in the game or you're going to get something you don't like. And the more general response is, yes, it's a risk. I can accept that, maybe the scientists are right, that means we have a climate risk. Maybe they're wrong, that means we have a policy risk. So let's try to find some way to manage these two, to come up with a policy that's sane, good for the economy, but can also manage the climate risk if it really is a problem, which I think it is, but perhaps the person I'm talking to doesn't. So how do we sort of balance all these needs?
I think on that question, we need one of your pivot points. You talked about, we have to acknowledge this concern, whether we share the concern or not. We would need to say, that seems like a serious concern for you, and really try and understand that, just try and feel it from their point of view, not to parry with it, and then try and offer our solution, which I think actually is a pretty good alternative to their fears. So, but if you can not make it seem like, but actually feel what it's like to be in that person's shoes who's worried about the collapse of the free market system, you'll get a better communication channel with that person.
I think that's a good point. So yeah, sometimes the more sort of opaque and vague the question seems to be, the more you want to go into deep dive listening mode and just listen and hear what they're saying and listen, and then all of a sudden something's going to spark for you.
Can I make a short comment on that, please?
Yes.
I was talking to Senator Cochran's aide one time about the best way to try to get the point across. And I made the statement in a presentation that if the Republicans don't step up to the plate and get involved in the solution, the Democrats are going to solve the problem for us, and we won't like the solution. And he thought that was a very, very effective statement to use when talking to the conservative politicians. And he asked me to use it more.
Yeah, okay, all right. So great question on the Jerry Taylor one there. So the next question is, I'll paraphrase this one, or maybe I won't. He says, it's talking about my brother, he or she, talking about my brother. He's just pissed off because he cannot buy good light bulbs. He thinks it's all liberal nonsense. That one I'll paraphrase. How do we even get to square one with him? Where do I start with him? So any thoughts on that scenario? Is there any hope?
Hey, I've got 3 of the old light bulbs in my room upstairs,
Yeah, okay.
so if you need them.
Try the new color-corrected LEDs. They're great.
Okay, there we go.
Don't go below 2,700 Kelvin because they're
Exactly.
too blue. So
Fantastic. Okay.
All right, next
Well,
question.
I'll just add,
go ahead.
you know, I think that does get to another heart of the concern of the matter, which is, and Congressman Inglis says this, I think, very well. He says the big place where he differs from the traditionally progressive position on climate is the liberal view, so to speak, is we have to do with less, right? He always says, walk and eat bugs. That's a perfect example of, hey, I need light to read my book and to walk into the room at night and see what I'm doing. And this is the first step toward walking and eating bugs. And so I think we need to, I think to Jay's point, you know, I think we need to empathize with that and say, you know, you're right. We need, you know, that's what I like about a carbon price, because it sets the market incentive. People are still going to want light. They're still going to want refrigerated food, and they're still going to want air-conditioned homes. The market demand is not going away. The way that we achieve those things has to change. And the only way to do that is to put a clear market signal out there so investors and entrepreneurs and inventors get to work solving those problems so that you get better lights than we ever had before. And oh, by the way, they're more energy efficient. And so I think that the acknowledgement of, you're right, those lights suck, but there's a better future out there, and this is how we get there. That pivot, I think, could.
There you go.
I think it addresses
Choice.
the...
Choice is the other really
Choice,
good
yeah.
word to use. We're giving people choices. We're not saying
Yeah.
we're taking away things, but
Yeah.
we're giving you choices. That's very positive.
I think the bigger issue for this gentleman is just the fact that the government is forcing him to do something
Yeah.
he doesn't want to do, and he doesn't think is right. And it's back to that big government issue, and that's where fee and dividend is not a big government regulatory issue. So I think that's really the bottom line for that gentleman's complaint.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. So then questions, probably Zori, more your area, questions coming in about business. How does someone get start leveraging a business ally? Who do they talk to? Do they just call someone? Do they go down there? Can I talk to the CEO? I mean, give us some thoughts about how you get started in getting a business ally.
Sustainability officers are really great places to start. In the bigger businesses, most have a corporate sustainability officer whose name's on a website, and reaching out to that person, maybe suggesting coffee or lunch or some way of having a personal chat, opens up, I think, the first step in conversation. Those people also know other corporate sustainability officers. Then you find out where their next meeting is, or which conference they're going to, or which events are in their circles. So you create a network, and you find the people that are receptive, and you find the people that aren't, and that's a really great entry point. So rather than going directly to a Chamber of Commerce and just trying to pick people off the list, I mean, of course, there are companies that are more ecologically friendly, that have something on their website that shows they're trying to reduce their carbon footprint. Those are good places to start, too.
Great, okay. Is that Chief Sustainability Officer? Is that a title, or is there a certain title it goes with, or just someone that's in sustainability?
They're different titles. The size of the company will determine what the title
makes
is.
sense. Okay, another question. Will it work to offer a presentation to a local Republican committee, and how do I do that? Any thoughts on, yes?
I noticed on our town website that Lexington, I live in Lexington, Massachusetts, Republican committee was having a meeting at our library. And they didn't have a website that you could communicate about whether you wanted to go. So I just showed up, and I brought some of my materials. We're working on a state-level carbon fee and dividend in Massachusetts, so our state legislator has introduced the bill. So I just showed up. People were arriving in the room, and they said, "Oh, hi, what brings you here?" And I said, "I just wanted to have a chat. I just wanted to let you know we have this bill before our state House that's pretty interesting." And they said, "Oh, what's it about?" I said, "Oh, addressing climate change." And then there was this visceral kind of reaction. So they said, "Well, sure, why don't you tell us about it?" So just kind of jumped into the fray, and immediately it was clear that some of the people were absolute deniers. It was also clear that some people were curious. So I just kind of let it roll, and we actually gathered some allies from that meeting. And I used the if term. This is the kind of neutralizing confrontation suggestion that I have. Rather than saying, we need to do something about climate change, you say, if you think we need to do something about climate change, here's a solution that you could try. And that way, you're not having an argument with them. You're just putting some information out there. So the deniers are rolling their eyes in the background, and then there's some people kind of leaning forward going, So that's my 2 cents.
I guess I would just add, and I said this in the last presentation, swim in the same circles. I mentioned before Congressman Ingles is coming to Houston in August, and we've set that up for him. We've set up a whole tour for him. And, you know, these things snowball. As you meet people, as you develop relationships, it snowballs. You never know what's going to happen. I mean, I've actually become pretty good friends with the president of the local log cabin Republican group because we went out and had some beer. I mean, I initially approached him. You know, it was kind of transactional at first. Hey, we got this event. You guys interested? But we've developed a relationship over time, and he's still not there on climate yet. I'm working on him, but I mean, in the meantime, I'm really enjoying this relationship, and he's introduced me to others, and we just found out we share a lot in common. So, you know, just swim in the same circles, and things will happen.
Excellent. Okay. Another question here about if you're talking about carbon fee and dividend, and a Republican is then coming back with something that's not the actual CCL, but they're saying, well, what about a corporate tax reduction in that? How do you handle that? Maybe Jay, that's a question for you.
I always say, and we hear that a lot, everyone has a different idea of what to do with the revenue from a price on carbon. This might be a little rogue, but I say that's an interesting idea, and I acknowledge that. And I also acknowledge that, I state that Citizens Climate Lobby, we advocate for a full rebate. But that I also am realistic that by the time our bill makes its way through Congress and through the sausage making, we call it, of the give and take that will be required to pass a bill, that we know that there will be some changes. And so we welcome their ideas to the table. I think it's more important that they're thinking about what to do with the revenue. You know, I feel like if we get down to the level of detail that how do we give back this price on carbon, this revenue, then we are really on third base headed toward home. So I welcome that conversation.
Great point. One of the best problems to have, right, if we're at
Yes.
that level. So another question here on, it was mentioned sanctity and degradation was mentioned as a value held highly by conservatives. How do these play out in their thoughts about climate change? I don't know if you guys want to take that or Grant wants to take that. Or Rob, whoever. Let me grab the one more microphone. Sorry, I think I stole his microphone. Did you want to take that one, Grant? Want me to reread the question? Or you got it?
I heard it. I think those are two opposites. I think this is the last question. Those are opposites. So the sanctity, they're not in favor of degradation. I want to be clear about that. That's the opposite of sanctity. And it's curious. I'm not sure exactly how you do it. It depends on how it shows up, and maybe it doesn't show up quite that clearly. That's just, again, this is Haight's description of how he sees the moral foundation differences between the two. It would seem obvious to a progressive that sanctity is a very high issue in terms of preserving the earth. Doesn't show up that way on the other side because, as it's been said here and earlier, the worry about, if you might say, the sanctity of the economy, the sanctity of free enterprise. I mean, sanctity can mean different things to different people, that needs to be preserved. I'm not telling you that's the answer, but remember, we have to, and I think Bruce said it very well, if it's a vague question or a vague concern, that's a great opportunity to ask open-ended questions and just sort of pivot and pivot and pivot until you find a spot where there's a common ground.
Great. All right, I think we are out of time. I see the red card flashing. So thank you, Grant. Thank you, Rob. And thank you to our esteemed panelists.